going to start talking about perceiving motion. Gives us some questions to answer, which we will come back to at the end. And some of these might feel like you have some idea of how this works already. And so we will be fitting into that semantic space with some scientific terminology. So one question is, why do some animals freeze in place when they sense danger? Might ask how films create movement from still pictures. Over the years, I've had a few film students or students who make films and create films who talk about the number of frames per second. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then what's special about movement of human and animal bodies? So we'll talk about biological motion and why and how it is special. As we look at the functions of motion perception, they start this chapter like they do a lot of the chapters, especially the higher level vision chapters. They start with it's crucial for survival. So they actually start early on by talking about this woman, case study of LM, who has akinetopsia, which is a motion agnosia. So there's damage to specific areas of the middle temporal regions, but we're going to see these regions are important for motion, and they just stop being able to see movement. And this is actually a quite dangerous disorder to have. And they talk about how LM doesn't really often leave her house because people they'll just pop up and be there. Usually movement tells us there are these changes in our environment, but that's not telling her these changes are occurring. Cars will be far away, and then they'll be close. And so without that perception of movement and the changes in depth that are happening over time, again, it's really quite dangerous. And she even talks about something as simple as filling up a cup with water or coffee or something, that we are using the movement of that rising in the cup to tell us when to stop, but she doesn't see that, so she doesn't know when to stop pouring. Gives us is attentional capture, and we've actually talked about this a couple of times, at least once with the when we talked about color and the man who lost his color vision, that he said, now I can have to find my dog through the movement, right? Because the dog isn't kind of popping out from around the trees and all of those just shades of gray now. It's not as distinguished. But we use this attentional capture. If you look at these animals that are really well camouflaged, we can barely tell where the animal is versus where the plants and things are. But as soon as that animal moves, that object comes together, and we can see what the animal is, and we find it because of the movement. I have this example of birds. You might notice throughout these lectures that I talk a lot about birds and butterflies and things. And so with hearing, that we can kind of figure out in space where a bird is, but it's not until we see it that we get the exact, this is where the bird is. And one of the ways we often find birds is, especially those that are well camouflaged, is through movement. Is when they move. So I asked for other examples here. You can pause and think about other examples of attentional capture. Another example they give is just trying to find a friend in a sea of faces. And so when that friend starts to wave at you, it makes it a lot easier to find them. Tells us about objects. He gives us the example of the car moving toward us, and we can think of that car in that first perspective. We can go back to think about object recognition and how we talked about perspective, and we might have these accidental viewpoints. It's really difficult for most of us to see what kind of car that is, but when the car comes and turns, then we get more information, which tells us what kind of car this is. The second example is our own movement. So when we're moving around this horse, this piece of art, it kind of looks from one perspective, it looks like a horse. From one perspective, it looks like a horse with it's flat, the legs are flat. And then when we get behind it, it's sitting up. So we're getting more and more information about this piece of art as we walk around it. tells us about events in our environment. I don't know if they've taken the example out of just watching someone at a retail store as they are folding clothes, and then they go to help the person and use the cash register. That those small movements of the hands tell us what's going on in the movement of the clothes. All of that tells us what's going on in that scene. And then there's a large movement, and there's a change. And then they go to the cash register, and different movements are occurring. So those movements tell us about those events and what is happening. So this picture is a link, which I will include. It's some of the short videos of motion are some of my favorite videos to show, and I really love this because what you can kind of see in the still is that it looks kind of like the larger triangle chases around the smaller triangle and the circle. But when you're really watching it in the video, it's amazing how we are ascribing intentionality and emotions and all of these things to just these geometric shapes because of the way that they are moving. And it attracts attention. So I've talked about attentional capture and other ways it attracts attention. We can use this, all right? So this video, which it's in the PowerPoints, but I usually don't include it because it's long, but it's about 12 minutes or so. If you're really into magic and how they use certain movements to capture your visual system so that you're watching this movement so that they can perform other things in these changes where you're not paying attention. It's kind of a flattened video. We are looking at studying motion perception, and we are trying to figure out how people perceive motion perception. We might try utilizing real motion, but this is actually really tricky. We would have to get people or somebody or some things and physically move them around in the room to look at real motion. What we end up looking at most of the time is apparent motion. So we're watching movement on some kind of screen where this is actually discrete, right? There are changes, there are certain frame rates and changes that are occurring that cause this apparent motion. We actually talked about this earlier when we talked about Gestalt psychology and the stroboscope and that turning that around. There's little figures that change just very slightly, and we can see that apparent motion. I will also say this number 2 is a link, and I'm going to include it again. These really short videos for movement are some of my favorite videos to show. So I'm glad we get to do this. It's been a while since I've talked about movement. We also have flashing lights, which we talked about before, that phi phenomenon. If I flash a light, it disappears, and I flash a new light. If I do that with a light in a new place, I do that with the right timing, it's going to look like there's this movement from one place, that light going from one place to another place, even though they are two static events, creating this perception of this continuous change. We see movement where there wasn't any. 2006 fMRI study, Larson and colleagues found that real and apparent motion activated the same regions of the brain. So we're looking back here in the visual cortex, and whether we have the phi phenomenon of one box coming up and then the new box, versus whether we are actually having that box move across the screen, we see activity in the same region. And you can see they're comparing this to a control condition where both boxes are just up. So we're seeing those two boxes, and we see activation in the occipital lobes in the visual cortex. But you can see there's activation between those two regions when we are perceiving this movement. And again, whether it's real movement or illusory movement. Another really illusory experience of motion is induced motion, where a larger object that is moving can cause a smaller stationary object appear to move. This is the reason it sometimes looks like the moon is moving through the clouds, even though what's happening is the moon is relatively stationary in comparison to the clouds that are moving, but the clouds are larger, and so it looks like we can get this illusion of the moon moving. The best example and the most relatable example is probably the stoplight phenomenon. When you're like next to it's usually when it's a big truck or something, you're next to a big truck or something, and they're pulling forward a little bit, and it feels like you have this sense that, it looks like you are rolling backwards, and so you press harder down on your brake, but you didn't need to, right? You're braking. It just feels like, it looks like you're moving. Motion after effects. So after watching a stimulus for a while, they give the example in a book of a waterfall. So I guess this is where they first discovered it, or they first started talking about this illusion from Robert Adams, looking at this waterfall for long enough where that water is going down, and then you look away and it looks like the world is moving upward. I get these pretty strongly when I watch video games for too long, those racing games. I used to watch those, and then I could feel this, or I could see this movement afterwards. I think at least one of these links works, so I'm going to go find out which one and include that, or give you that option. What are we trying to explain when we're trying to explain movement and motion detection? Part of the issue that makes it really difficult to explain is that motion detection cannot be explained by what is happening on the retina by itself. We need something in addition to just retinal displacement to explain motion detection. So in the first picture, we see that if we're moving our eyes and we're watching Jeremy walk across the room, then Jeremy is actually staying still on the retina, or he's not moving across the retina because we're keeping him on our foveal vision, but still we perceive movement. And you can see written under there, there is this local disturbance in the optic array, and we'll talk a little bit about the optic array. That is our perceptual space that we are moving through, or that things are moving through. If instead what's happening is, I think they have this, if Maria's eyes are still and Jeremy walks across the room, now Jeremy is moving on the retina because the retina is staying still and Jeremy's moving across the retina. However, we can move our eyes around a room, like in the third example, and now everything's moving around on the retina, everything's moving across the retina as we're moving our eyes around back and forth. But we're not detecting motion, even though now we have movement on the retina. So the movement on the retina isn't telling me that there's movement in the world. In this very bottom-up theory that comes from J.J. Gibson, he was the person who really promoted an ecological approach to perception, and he gets talked about a lot in the taking action chapter as we are taking action in our environment, and and movement occurs around us in a certain way as we are taking action in our environment, and he wanted to see this in real environments, so heads-up displays in airplanes and things like that, as opposed to looking at a screen, which particularly back in the 50s and 60s, that wasn't very realistic. Now, of course, it kind of is more realistic, but in this bottom-up kind of approach or theory, he is quoted as saying, "Ask not what's inside your head, but what your head is inside of." So what is my environment? J.J. Gibson's approach, this ecological approach, we see a local disturbance in the optic array. That is going to tell me that Jeremy's moving across the room. And when we're moving our eyes to the right, the entire scene is going to shift to the left, but we don't have that same kind of local disturbance in the optic array. So we can take this into account as we are perceiving or detecting motion. We also have that as our body moves, we have global optic flow information, which again was introduced in the Taking Action chapter, but we'll talk about it now, that as we are moving through an environment, the things are moving around us, and the things that are closer to us are moving by more quickly, and the things that are farther away appear to be moving by more slowly. And then we have this focus of expansion, this point that we might be walking towards that is getting closer, but it's not moving in the same way as what's around us is basically moving. So as our body moves, we get that optic flow information. A more neural explanation of how we might account for eye movements, and then motion detection. And according to corollary discharge theory, movement is detected if the comparator, which is in quotes, it's some region of the brain that they haven't completely found a single region, but they have found some regions that seem to be doing this, making this comparison, if it receives a signal that the eye is moving. Okay, so when I'm following Jeremy with my eyes are moving, and I get a corollary discharge signal that Jeremy is staying still on my retina because I'm watching. I'm following that with my eyes. Or, so movement is detected if the signal that the eye is moving is received, or if the comparator receives a signal that an image is being displaced across the retina. So this image displacement signal. So if my eyes are still and Jeremy moves across the room, we have this image displacement and no corollary discharge, right? The corollary discharge is me moving my eyes, but I'm not moving my eyes. So I get image displacement and not the corollary discharge. If we get both of those things, the corollary discharge and the image displacement, now both of those reach the comparator simultaneously, like when we are scanning a room, and so everything's moving around the room, but my eyes are moving also. Both of those things are happening. Then no movement is detected. A few pictures that are helpful for kind of picturing this. So my eye is stationary, I'm still, the person's moving across the eye, so I'm getting image displacement. That information goes to the comparator, some region of the brain, and that says to the brain, that image, that person is moving. Or I can be following the person and my eye is moving to follow that person. The person is moving, so they're staying really stable on the eye. They're staying foveated, and so they're in the same region of my eye. And so the comparator is receiving the corollary discharge that I'm moving my eye. And so now we can also see now that the person is moving. We're detecting movement. And finally, when I'm moving my eye in a stationary room, what is happening is my eye is moving. I'm sending a corollary discharge as I'm sending that. Part of what this picture shows is the signal to the muscles to move the eye is sending that corollary discharge, but we're also getting image displacement. So the comparator is receiving both of those signals together simultaneously, and so now we do not detect movement out in the environment. Corollary discharge theory is a really neat theory and has been talked about ever since I can remember. It's very difficult to find research on corollary discharge theory by that name. I've looked that up a few times and it doesn't really work. I will say that because of the fact that when Jeremy is moving through the room and I'm following him with my eyes, there are a number of things going on. He's still on my retina and I'm moving my eyes, but the room is also moving on my eyes. And we don't perceive the room as moving around Jeremy, even though apparently we're doing this for all of these things at the same time, but I want there to be velocities. So people moving in opposite directions, and I want potentially as I'm driving through my car, as I'm driving in my car and I'm receiving all of these signals about optic flow and movement across the scene, and my eyes are moving, but people can move in opposite directions, and we can still see those people move in opposite directions. Some people can move more slowly than others or more quickly, and we can see that as well. And so that environmental explanation where we talk about disturbances in the optic array, it needs to be taken into account somehow. And I'm gonna stop this here, this first part, and feel like I've gotten through corollary discharge theory, which is usually a pretty difficult theory for students to kind of grasp and handle. So please do ask questions.